This episode of Brains on Games is about a war game where your soldiers are dice. Welcome to Brains on Games. I'm Dr. Brian McDonald, and this episode we are going to talk about a war game that involves dice placement. This is a game that I was lucky enough to play with the designer before it came up on Kickstarter. We played on Tabletop Simulator, but it's now more widely available. The Kickstarter is over, and I think you can find this in retail. It's a game called Dice Command, which was sent to me by the folks over at, you can't see their name, Ejected Planet. This is a game for between 2 and 4 players. You can play it with kids age 14 and up, but I think younger kids, if they're familiar with strategy games, should be able to figure this out and have some fun. And the game takes about 45 minutes. So we're going to take a look at Dice Command, but I haven't set it up yet because I want to show you what's inside this box. First of all, the box with everything inside of it does manage to close completely flat, but if you look here, once I open it up, what you're going to see is first the rule book and then the game maps. Now, if you're playing a 2-player game, you just use this board. But if you play a 4-player game in 2 teams of 2, then these 2 things fit together. And then there's different configurations if you're playing a 3 or a 4-player free-for-all kind of a game. Underneath the maps, you see that there are 2 boxes. These 2 boxes hold the dice. They double as your dice rolling tray, and all the other components and cards fit right in here. So let me get this set up and we will take a look at Dice Command. I've set up the map for a 2-player game because that's how I've played it. It's wider when you've got 3 or 4 players, but it's super narrow and tight when you're only playing with a couple of people, which is great because that keeps the player interaction going. You start the game with that dice tray like I showed you earlier. That's your barracks and has pictures of soldiers' bunks in here, and that's where you're going to roll your dice. You also start the game with 5 dice in your barracks and 3 credits, and I'll show you how those things are going to be used. The second player gets 1 additional credit, so once you've decided who's going first and who's going second, the second player will get an extra one. The first player gets the first player marker, which in the version of the game that I have is a dog tag. So you've got this metal dog tag to indicate who goes first. Players are also going to start the game with these 4 cards in front of them. They're command cards. This is your headquarters and where you're going to place dice in order to take actions in the game. You'll start as well with a couple of facilities. There are 2 spots on the map that are numbered. Each player at the start of the game is going to get 2 of these, and they get to choose one that they're going to play with. So each player gets 2 of these things, and then they get to choose one of them that they'll place on the board. So this one is a munitions depot, and you can increase your unit's power by 1 before you start a battle, and that might go over here. This is a field hospital where you get to heal units after a battle, and we'll put that over there. So if a player controls one of these sites, they'll get to use the associated ability. The other feature that adds some replayability and some randomness to the game are these tactical advantage cards. So you've got this big stack of cards at the top of the deck. There's a ceasefire card that goes underneath those ones because if you run out of these cards, that's the end of the game, and the ceasefire tells you how you're going to count up the scoring to determine who won. So that goes face up at the bottom of this deck, and there are going to be 3 of these face up at any given time. We'll talk about how they get used. Finally, the version of the game that I have has an expansion, this special ops deck that gives each player some kind of extra ability that allows them to break the rules or gives them some kind of advantage during the game. Just like with those facilities, you deal out 2 of these to each player. They choose one of them and the other one gets discarded. It might be things like being allowed to deploy extra units with a certain number on them, and we'll talk about what all of that means when we get into the actual rules of the game. So you may start with that special ops deck. You're definitely going to start with these 2 facilities, 3 of these tactical advantage cards, and then of course your command cards here, which are going to be how you're going to take actions. Once you've got everything set up, how do you play this game? Well, at the beginning of each turn, there's a prepare phase where start of turn effects would take place. So before you take any actions, some things might happen at the beginning of the turn before you can do anything. One example is if you've upgraded using research tokens, we'll talk about all that stuff If you've upgraded the financing command card at the start of your turn, if you have 4 or more credits, you get 1 extra one. So that would take place during the prepare phase. The next thing you're going to do is roll the dice that are here in your barracks. Now there are some extra dice that are in your reserve. They haven't been recruited yet. So you start with those 5 and you just roll them. Those are the dice that you're going to be placing in order to play the game. Once you've rolled those dice, you're going to assign dice and credits and research tokens, if you have any, to the command cards in order to take some actions. The research tokens are very important and we'll talk about them. But for example, you might decide that you want to deploy a unit onto the board, and here in your headquarters, you can put some dice that you want to put onto the map. The headquarters will also allow you to advance or move one of your units. Now, your units can only move straight ahead or diagonally. So you can't move backwards unless you have some special card that will allow you to do that. But once we get to resolving the actions, we'll talk about how that all would look. I might want to spend a credit to conscript an extra unit and bring that into my barracks. I might want to earn some money, but let's say I'll put some some dice onto the research and development card. If I put one here in financing, that would allow me to earn more credits once I resolve all of these actions. Now the dice are placed, the credits are placed, now the actions get resolved, and you can resolve those in any order that you want. Now, one thing that I'll do first, research and development, so my dice go back in the box, and this allows me, by placing 2 dice on the research and development card, that's going to allow me to earn a research token. These are used during the assign phase to upgrade your command cards so that they have some more powerful actions that they can do. If you do manage to collect 5 of these, though, you can upgrade the research and development card, but that's a nuclear strike, which will allow you to place some of your soldiers behind enemy lines. I'll spend this coin here for the conscription action, which allows me to put an extra die in the barracks. Finally, the last thing that I wanted to do on my turn is to deploy my units and advance one of them. So I've got 2 units to deploy here in my headquarters, and we'll put them on the board. Maybe we'll leave a little bit of space in between them in case something comes my way that's unexpected. Now, advancing varies depending on the number on the top of the die. If it's a number from 1 to 3, that's a light infantry unit, and it can move 2 spaces instead of just 1. And remember, it can only move forward straight in a straight line or diagonally. If it's a number from 4 to 6, like the second die that I placed, that's a heavy infantry unit. It can only move 1 space. But there's one other kind of unit, an armored division, and these are really powerful ones. If I had placed 2 of the same die, say I had rolled 2 3s, for example, at the beginning of my turn, I could have stacked them on top of each other in this deploy area, and then they would be deployed as an armored division. These ones are more powerful because really you've got this extra die underneath. So if the top one gets knocked off somehow, there's still another soldier underneath that's going to hop out and continue the battle. Now, armored divisions can only move 1 space, just like heavy infantry. Now I've taken all my actions and I've advanced one of my units here. My turn is over, but the last thing I have to do is refresh the tactical advantage cards. I didn't use any of these cards, so if I had used one, it would get discarded. So say I wanted to use a flamethrower, for example, that would do 3 damage to 3 units that are in front of the one who's using the card. It would cost me 2 credits in order to use the flamethrower. That would get discarded if I had used it. I did not use any of these cards, so the one that's to the right gets discarded. Everything else moves over, and then we draw a new card that gets put in its place here. Additional things that might happen is that one of these cards might allow me to sabotage the other player's command cards, so I could block them from doing something. Maybe I could stop them from advancing if I had some ability that would allow me to sabotage their command cards. You might also get some mines. Here's a mine token. So some of the cards allow me to deploy mines onto the map, and if a soldier walks across that, it's going to explode and cause some problems for them. Eventually, these pieces are going to meet on the board, and how do those battles get resolved? say, for example, I had this fella right up here and he moved onto the space where my light infantry is, that's going to subtract the amount. So I've got a 3 versus a 2. So that's going to eliminate this number 2, and that's going to go back into my reserve. And this number 3 is now going to be down to a 1 because they were damaged in that battle by whatever the number is on the top of the die. So you're doing a little bit of math in that case. Now, if we were doing this armored division versus my heavy infantry, now the armored division has 2 dice that say 4 on them. So if this one had moved on to the 6, it would eliminate the 6. The 4 would be gone, and then I'd have to drop this one by 2 as well. One other important thing about those armored divisions is that light infantry can't damage them at all. That really makes it an important piece in the game, but it is taking up 2 of those dice instead of 1. And that's the tricky push and pull of this game. The more dice that are in your bunker, the more actions that you have. However, as you place those soldiers on the map, now you have fewer actions because the dice are on the board instead of being available for you to place on your command cards. And sometimes you need, for example, if you do this nuclear strike, atomic warfare, to place units behind enemy lines by placing 5 research tokens here on this space. Those units have to come from your reserve, which means they can't already have been conscripted into your bunker. So that was something that really slowed us down a little bit. We had to think about it. We wanted more actions. We wanted to at least have a couple of these guys still in our reserve. And we wanted soldiers on the board, but not so many that we couldn't do anything with them. If I had placed all of my units on the board, then I couldn't advance them at all. And advancing units, of course, is important because the way you win this game, the victory condition is, at least in a 2-player game, is to get 4 of your soldiers behind the enemy lines onto these darker spaces on the back of the board. So I've put the red ones back here instead of the black ones. It would make more sense if I put the black dice on this side. One other thing that I'll mention before we move on to skills and final thoughts about the game is that, like I said earlier, you can only move forward or diagonally unless you're right here deployed just on this line, and then you are allowed to move sideways to prevent these guys from getting in. But of course, my light infantry can't stop this armored division from getting through. We're talking here about a game that's abstract in that you're using dice to represent your soldiers, but it does make it very straightforward in terms of how you're tracking how much damage has been done and what your dice can do on the board. But because the soldiers and the actions are basically using the same pieces, it's a real, like I said, it's a real decision. You've always got choices to make, and there are never enough dice to go around, is what we found when we played the game. It definitely kept things interesting. It's thematic in that everything is like the artwork, the style, the graphic design of these things are just exactly what you would want in a war game like this. You've got the randomness of the tactical advantage cards and the facilities here on the side of the map, which adds to the replayability, I think, because each game is going to be a little bit different depending on what cards came up. And you're also, debating how much are you going to advance versus leave some soldiers in the background to protect your lines here and prevent people from getting through. Everything, what would I change about this game? Not a single thing. Everything about it, I think, is perfect. The pieces are great. The components are fantastic. Everything fits in the box, and you've got these 2 little bunker boxes that turn into 4 dice trays that allow you to store everything away neatly. Maybe they could have included some extra baggies to divide up the dice by color, because there's one big baggie for the dice. So it's not very organized. You have to pick everything up. But one thing I've learned as a person who plays board games all the time is that you save as many of those little baggies as you can, and then I can organize things however I like. This really is a visual spatial problem-solving game. In some ways, like chess, you're predicting where pieces are going to move on the board and where you can get your pieces to go. And that is a spatial skill, and it becomes more complicated when the map is wider and you're playing in teams, or you're playing 4 people all against one another. There is, though, a huge component of those executive functioning skills that we've talked about many, many times. This is one of those executive functioning style games where you're thinking ahead and planning ahead, and you sort of have to have a goal in mind and stick with it a little bit, remembering not to deploy all of your soldiers unless you're going to sacrifice some so that you have some in reserve. That was constantly the battle. I remember my son had all of these upgrade tokens. He was spending all of his soldiers to get tons of upgrade tokens, and he would sort of put his soldiers on the map in ways where it was very tempting for me to attack them because he didn't have enough left in the reserve to do his nuclear strike that would allow him to get his soldiers, jump them ahead behind enemy lines. So because he had no reserves, he couldn't do anything with that. And I sort of tried to avoid his soldiers as much as I could so that he wouldn't have anything left in the reserves. Eventually, though, he figured it out. He started sacrificing soldiers so that he could whittle mine down, and then he had some more in the reserve, and he got me in that way. But it's such an interesting game in terms of all of the options that you have, and you never have enough actions to do everything or enough credits or enough research tokens to do all the things you might like to do. You really have to choose how you're going to spend those things. And the fact that there's a new tactical advantage that's going to pop up every turn is really going to be tempting and might change your plans. And that, in a nutshell, is Dice Command. It's a very thematic dice placement game with lots of replayability because of the randomness, and it does exercise those visual spatial problem solving skills and the executive functioning skills. I didn't even mention working memory, which is one of the executive functioning skills. It's the whiteboard in your mind where you juggle information, and with all of these things happening on the board, there is a lot of information to juggle, so it's good practice for that ability as well. We really enjoyed this game. If you have questions or comments, you can leave them in the comment section below the video, or you can email me at brian@brainsongames.ca. Brainsongames.ca is the website. That's where future episodes will go, and the previous ones are up there already. Brains on Games is the Twitter handle and the Facebook page and the Instagram feed, so we're all over the place. And if you enjoyed this video and you want to be notified of future ones, you can head on over to YouTube and click that subscribe button. Thanks for joining me, and hopefully I'll see you next time.